On 25th July 1945, in the quiet Bavarian town of Bad Tölz, General George S Patton stood alone. The war in Europe was officially over, yet the silence around him felt heavier than artillery fire. And Patton sensed something was wrong that morning. Patton had expected to be driving east, chasing the retreating German lines, dreaming of Berlin, not polishing boots for a parade. Instead, orders from above froze him in place. A halt that came not from the enemy, but from allies and politicians in Washington. This decision, made far from the front, during a single week in July, would ripple across Europe. While cameras prepared for victory parades, Soviet armies kept moving west. Cities bled and prisoners vanished. Behind closed doors, strategic choices hardened, timelines slipped, and tens of thousands of lives edged toward darkness. Patton felt the weight of history pressing down, his instincts screaming to advance, his hands tied by protocol that day. The world believed peace had arrived, but in the gap between surrender and settlement, danger still breathed quietly. What happened in this pause, this deliberate stop, would shape borders, lives, and the next half-century. In Bad Tölz, flags hung limp in summer air, officers whispered rumors, and Patton read dispatches in silence. British commanders urged restraint, American politicians sought optics, and Moscow watched every mile gained closely. For Patton, speed was salvation, delay was death, and waiting felt like betrayal to him. Each hour mattered, each road left open changed fate, and civilians stood trapped between futures unseen. As July waned, the parade drums grew louder. The guns fell quiet, and a crucial choice hardened. The order to stop Patton was already written, its consequences not yet counted, its cost still invisible then. On 26th July 1945, the order became reality, not rumor. Patton's Third Army, spread across southern Germany, was told to hold position, stand down, and prepare for ceremony. Fuel was rationed, movements logged, and armored columns that once thundered forward now sat idle, engines cold. For soldiers on the ground, the war felt unfinished, unresolved, dangerous in its stillness. Refugees crowded roads, displaced families begged for protection, and former Nazi officials quietly slipped away unnoticed. Every pause created space, and space invited chaos, especially in shattered Europe. Patton argued fiercely, sending cables up the chain, warning that delay favored the Soviets, not peace. He understood momentum, understood that armies did not simply stop existing because papers were signed. Somewhere, east of the Elbe, Red Army units pushed forward, occupying towns, seizing factories, and securing political leverage. Each mile they gained in that week became permanent ink on post-war maps. In Washington, optics mattered more than speed. Unity mattered more than urgency. Appearances more than consequences. A parade, planned for the American public, required discipline, obedience, and stillness. On 28th July 1945, Patton toured his lines, speaking quietly to officers, frustration etched deep. He saw abandoned camps, half-liberated prisoners, and intelligence reports marked pending, gathering dust. Some German units still carried weapons. Some SS elements melted into forests, waiting for confusion. Patton believed this was the most dangerous moment of the war, the moment everyone pretended it was over. But his voice carried less weight now, his reputation already troublesome to higher command. By the end of the week, Soviet flags flew farther west, borders shifted silently, and civilians disappeared behind new lines. No battle marked this loss, no headlines recorded it, no medals reflected it. The cost accumulated quietly in prisons, camps, and forced marches far from cameras. The week Patton was stopped passed without gunfire, yet history was being rewritten line by line. On 30th July 1945, the consequences of delay began to surface slowly. Reports arrived at Third Army headquarters, thin folders describing disappearances, arrests, and sudden border closures. Civilians who had greeted American tanks days earlier were now beyond reach, trapped behind Soviet lines. Patton read these briefings with visible anger, recognizing patterns he had warned about repeatedly. This was not victory settling, this was power shifting, methodically. Across Central Europe, Soviet security units moved in behind the front, hunting collaborators, officers, and anyone deemed unreliable. Former prisoners of war were gathered, loaded onto trains and sent east, destinations rarely recorded. In towns like Plauen and Zwickau, American patrols stopped at invisible lines, forbidden to cross, waiting. Those lines had not existed a week earlier, yet now they were permanent, enforced. Every delay granted legitimacy to occupation, every hour hardened control. Patton requested permission to move reconnaissance units forward, even symbolically, but approval never came. Eisenhower's headquarters stressed diplomacy, caution and alliance stability. Above all else, the war in the Pacific demanded attention. Nuclear decisions loomed, and Europe became secondary. Patton felt Europe slipping away, not through defeat, but through hesitation. His frustration spilled into conversations, diaries and sharp remarks, carefully noted by superiors. On Brussels, August of 1945, the parade date approached. Uniforms were pressed, speeches rehearsed. Meanwhile, intelligence estimated tens of thousands already detained or relocated. During that single week, these were not battlefield deaths, but administrative losses erased quietly. No gunshots marked their passing. No graves bore dates, only files stamped and sealed. History often counts bodies after battles, not after meetings. Patton understood something others ignored. Wars do not end cleanly. They end unevenly, brutally, in margins and pauses. The decision to stop, to wait, to look composed, carried a price. And that price was being paid by people whose names would never be spoken on parade grounds. On 3 August 1945, Patton's patience finally fractured behind closed doors. In his diary, he wrote with bitterness, describing the halt as a political surrender, not a military one. He believed the war had shifted form from bullets to borders, and America was already losing ground. Around him, staff officers lowered voices, aware that criticism now carried consequences, carefully recorded. That same day, Soviet authorities formalized control across newly occupied zones, issuing orders in German and Russian. Local officials were replaced, radios seized and press offices shut down, methodically. Villages that had tasted freedom briefly now learned new rules. New flags, new fears. American officers watched from checkpoints, unable to intervene, bound by agreements signed weeks earlier. Every signature on those papers echoed louder than artillery now. Patton attempted one final push, requesting authority to secure key roads and industrial centers. He argued that stability required presence, not absence, that power filled vacuums immediately. The response from Eisenhower's staff was calm, firm, and final. Stand fast. The parade would proceed, the alliance would hold, and Patton would comply. On 5th August 1945, rumors spread through the ranks about Patton's future. His outspoken nature, his refusal to soften language, had made him a liability, not an asset. Some commanders admired his clarity. Others feared his unpredictability, especially in peacetime. The pause in operations was no longer temporary, it was symbolic. Patton was being sidelined, not just stopped. Meanwhile, trains moved east under guard. Lists grew longer. Families searched for names in vain. Estimates of those lost during this single week climbed, whispered numbers reaching 80,000. Not killed in battle, but captured by timing, agreements, and restraint. This was the hidden cost of peace, invisible in headlines, permanent in lives. As August advanced, the world prepared to celebrate victory. Fireworks replacing flares. Patton stood at the edge of history, watching momentum fade. He knew something had been taken that could never be reclaimed. Not territory, but time. On Zeus's August 1945, the parade finally unfolded, polished and deliberate. Bands played, flags waved, and cameras captured smiles meant to signal closure, stability, triumph. Patton rode in silence, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable to the cheering crowd. To the public, this was victory made visible. To Patton, it was momentum buried. Behind the spectacle, Europe continued to fracture along lines drawn without gunfire. Occupation zones hardened into borders, borders into ideologies, ideologies into futures. In cities like Leipzig and Dresden, Soviet control deepened, arrests accelerating under new authority. American intelligence tracked movements but could no longer influence outcomes. Bound by protocol, the war's aftermath was unfolding faster than its battles. Patton understood that perception now outweighed position. Washington wanted reassurance, Moscow wanted leverage, and neither wanted another general pushing forward. His reputation, built on speed and aggression, no longer fit the moment. In meetings, his warnings were met with polite silence, then ignored. The cost of delay had become an inconvenience, not a priority. On 19th August 1945, news of the atomic bombing reached Europe, shifting attention overnight. The world gasped, celebrations paused, and the Pacific War dominated every headline. Europe slipped further into the background, its unresolved wounds left unattended. For those trapped behind new lines, hope dimmed as focus moved elsewhere. That same day, Patton confided to close aides that history would misread this moment. Battles would be studied, casualties counted, victories praised. But the week of waiting, the week of restraint, would be forgotten. He feared that the dead of delay would never be named, never acknowledged. Their loss would dissolve into statistics, if remembered at all. As summer pressed on, Patton's command authority shrank subtly. He was still a general, still decorated, but no longer decisive. The parade had passed, the pause had ended, yet the damage remained. A war had ended, but another had quietly begun, shaped by that single week. On 12th August 1945, Patton's world narrowed quietly. New directives arrived, limiting movement, redefining authority, and reshaping the mission into administration. Combat instincts had no place here. Paperwork replaced planning, restraint replaced speed. For a commander built for motion, this was suffocation. Across the former front lines, consequences hardened into routine. Soviet control expanded through councils, security offices, and controlled food distribution. Civilians learned which words not to speak, which uniforms to fear, which borders not to cross. American patrols logged reports, sent cables, and received no replies. The pause had become policy. Patton toured displaced persons camps, walking among faces drained of certainty. Polish laborers, Baltic prisoners, and German civilians all asked the same question quietly. Would the Americans stay, or would they leave again? Patton could offer no promises, only silence and clenched fists. He understood that presence alone often meant survival. On 14th August 1945, Japan announced its surrender, ending the global war. Church bells rang, headlines exploded, and the world exhaled. For Europe, this should have meant relief, but for many it meant abandonment. Attention shifted permanently, resources redirected, decisions already locked. The Cold War's first lines were already drawn. Patton sensed his relevance slipping with each passing day. His warnings now sounded like bitterness, his urgency like insubordination. Superiors spoke of unity, cooperation, and long-term diplomacy. Patton spoke of human cost, irreversibility, and lost leverage. The two languages no longer translated. By mid-August, estimates of those lost during the halted week solidified. Tens of thousands detained, relocated, or vanished into systems without records. Not casualties of combat, but of timing, optics, and restraint. This was the arithmetic of peace, rarely taught, never paraded. Patton wrote that history would punish delay more harshly than defeat. He believed the parade marked not an ending, but a surrender of initiative. What followed would not be decided by generals, but by borders frozen in haste. And he knew with painful clarity that the moment to act had already passed. On 18th August 1945, the reckoning became personal for Patton. Whispers turned into confirmation. His command was under review, his future uncertain, his leash shortening. The man who had raced across France now found himself boxed in by memos, meetings, and caution. Speed had won wars, but it had also made enemies, especially in peace. In Frankfurt, Allied administrators debated governance, reconstruction, and denazification. line by careful line. Patton listened impatient, knowing power was already shifting eastward while they talked. Every delayed decision gave permanence to Soviet control, legitimacy to occupation, and silence to suffering. This was not negotiation in his mind, it was consolidation. On 20th August 1945, Patton's blunt remarks reached Washington, stripped of context. He spoke of replacing one tyranny with another, of freedom traded for convenience. To politicians, this sounded dangerous, destabilizing, unacceptable. To Patton, it was obvious, unavoidable, already happening. The gap between truth and diplomacy widened irreparably. Meanwhile, reports from Eastern Europe grew darker. Entire communities were relocated, borders sealed, and political opponents erased. Systematically, the brief American presence that had protected many was now a memory. Those caught in the transition learned that liberation had an expiration date. The week Patton was stopped had decided that deadline. On 22 August 1945, orders arrived removing Patton from meaningful operational command. Officially, it was administrative, routine, temporary. In reality, it was final. The general who had warned, pushed, and pleaded was now neutralized politely. No court-martial, no disgrace, just silence. Patton understood the message immediately. The war of movement was over. The war of narratives had begun. History would be curated, simplified, and softened. The uncomfortable truth of delay would be buried beneath victory speeches. Those 80,000 lives would never be linked to a single order. As summer faded, Europe settled into a divided calm. The front lines were gone, but walls were already rising, unseen. Patton watched this future arrive, powerless to stop it. He had been halted for a parade, but what followed was a partition. On 27 August 1945, Europe began to look stable, deceptively so. Markets reopened, trains ran on schedule, and occupation headquarters spoke of order restored. To outsiders, the chaos appeared managed, but beneath the surface, lines had hardened into cages. This was peace without freedom, quiet without justice. Patton moved through this new Europe like a ghost of momentum past. Invitations replaced orders, briefings replaced battle maps, ceremony replaced command. He attended meetings where words mattered more than action, where delay was reframed as wisdom. Every conversation reminded him that speed was now considered reckless. In Soviet zones, new governments formed under supervision, loyal and obedient. Political parties merged, opponents vanished, and elections were promised someday. Those taken during the critical week were now unreachable, absorbed into systems designed to forget them. American intelligence estimated many would never return. Their names dissolved into bureaucracy. The cost of that pause was no longer theoretical. On 3rd August 1945, Patton visited a former frontline village, now divided by authority. He spoke briefly with locals, careful, guarded, watched. Their questions were simple. Will this border stay? Will you come back? Will they take us? Patton had no answers, only the knowledge that answers already existed elsewhere. Decisions made in July had removed choice from the present. Back in headquarters, planners spoke of long-term containment, influence, balance. Patton thought of the lost week, the lost lives, the lost leverage. Containment, he believed, began with surrender, not strength. The irony cut deep. The war had been won through aggression, then lost through restraint. By the end of August, estimates of the human toll stabilized. 80,000 lives altered or erased without a single battle fought. No monuments marked them, no official histories named them. They were casualties of alignment, of optics, of timing. Patton wrote one final note that month, stating that history would mistake calm for peace. He believed the real conflict had simply changed shape. The parade was over, the music faded, but the consequences endured. What followed would define generations, all born from a single week of hesitation. On 2nd September 1945, the world officially declared the war over. Documents were signed, pens lifted, and history drew a hard line under 6 years of blood. For most, this date meant closure, relief, and finality. For Patton, it marked something else, the point of no return. Europe was now locked into shape, not by combat, but by agreement. Borders once fluid were frozen, patrols formalized, and authority codified. What had been temporary in July was now permanent in September. The pause that stopped Patton had become policy, doctrine, and destiny. Patton watched as American priorities shifted fully toward rebuilding the West. Funds flowed, plans formed, and alliances solidified carefully. The East was written off quietly as the price of stability. No one spoke publicly of the week that made this division inevitable. Silence proved more convenient than accountability. On September 1945, Patton addressed a small group of officers informally. He spoke of momentum, of moments lost, of decisions made too late. He warned them that wars are decided as much by hesitation as by force. Some listened, some dismissed it as bitterness, some remembered it forever. Meanwhile, those taken during the halted week were now beyond reach. Prison camps deep in the East absorbed them. Labor systems consumed them. Families waited, wrote letters, and received none back. The arithmetic of delay had settled into permanence. Patton's role diminished further, his voice increasingly ceremonial. He had become a symbol of a war that no longer existed. The future belonged to planners, diplomats, and ideologues. What he had tried to prevent was now entrenched reality. By mid-September, the narrative of victory was complete. Textbooks began forming their first drafts, clean and decisive. There was no chapter for the week of waiting, no footnote for 80,000 altered lives. Patton understood that history prefers clean endings, but real endings are messy, human, and unresolved. The parade had provided closure for the world. The cost of that closure would echo for decades. On 20th December 1945, George S. Patton's war finally ended. Not on a battlefield, but in silence. A car accident in Germany ended the life of a general who had never learned how to stop. The headlines were brief, respectful, and incomplete. They spoke of victories, medals, and speed, but not of the week that haunted him. By then, Europe was fully divided, East and West staring at each other across invisible walls. What had begun as temporary occupation had solidified into ideology, control, and fear. The decisions of late July were no longer debated, they were lived. Families remained separated, borders unmoving, lives permanently redirected. History recorded the end of the war as a moment of unity. But beneath that narrative lay a quieter truth. Peace had been negotiated unevenly. The halt that stopped Patton had not prevented conflict, it had postponed it. The Cold War did not begin with speeches, it began with pauses. Those 80,000 lives were never counted as casualties of command. They appeared in no battle report, no casualty list, no tribunal. They were absorbed into systems that thrived on anonymity. Their suffering became background noise to a victorious century. Patton believed that momentum was morality in war, that moving forward saved lives and hesitation destroyed them. His critics called him reckless, dangerous, unsuitable for peace. History, decades later, still argues the point. The parade that halted him faded into photographs and film reels. The applause ended, the music stopped, and the crowd went home. But the consequences of that week did not fade. They shaped borders, alliances, and generations raised behind walls. Wars are remembered for their battles, but they are decided just as often by what does not happen. By the orders not given, the roads not taken, the weeks spent waiting. The week Patton was stopped did not look like defeat, but it cost tens of thousands their freedom, their future, and their lives. And history, as Patton feared, almost forgot them.